Yeah, no, this is definitely not the stump to a second growth tree that I'm standing on right now. This tree would have been about 450 years old when it was cut down. See, I'm out here in the clear cut of what was an old growth forest that was cut down back in 2021 at a time when the BC government claimed that old growth logging had dropped to an all-time low as a result of regulations put in place in response to nationwide protests against old growth logging, which became known as the Fairy Creek blockades, which to date were the single largest act of civil disobedience in all of Canadian history. Around this time, the government committed to meeting 14 recommendations set up by their own strategic review to protect the last of forests like these while transitioning the industry to a truly sustainable and ethical model. Yet 3 years after that commitment date, and not a single one of these recommendations has been fully implemented, and reckless old growth logging continues throughout the province. Further information about the logging that was occurring back in 2021 confirms that despite their claims for record lows, the rates of old growth being logged was about 20% higher than what they had said it was, falling in line with the average for the years prior, which is when the forest that existed here would have been logged. They did hastily set aside some deferral areas for the most at-risk forests to allow the First Nations on whose land these forests stood time to form a management plan, yet a recent review of these areas finds that poor data allowed for many of the most high productivity old growth forests to be excluded from these deferrals altogether. For example, areas that were misidentified as being too young to meet the old growth definition were still available to be logged by companies who held the license in those tenures without consent or consultation from the nations on whose land they stood, despite them actually containing trees that were over 10 feet in diameter and over 500 years old. Additionally, satellite data shows that despite these deferral areas being off limits, many have already been logged or are currently being logged all over the province. That is absolutely ridiculous and a total failure of government policy. Now, it's important to understand that implementing many of the changes that they committed to takes a lot of work to execute, and there are many people in government doing their absolute best to make these changes happen right now. They recently announced allocation of $300 million for conservation funding to help support these First Nations in establishing Indigenous protected and conserved areas and transitioning away from reliance on old growth logging, which is absolutely incredible and a massive step forwards towards meeting the goal of these recommendations and supporting a just transition for everyone. At the same time, though, those in the industry with money and power are doing all they can to prevent these changes from actually taking place, from taking full advantage of these loopholes to keep logging as much as possible, to lobbying for watered down regulations or changes to the Forest Practices Code that would make it in line with the ecological science of today, not the outdated science of the 90s. This is why it's so critically important that we, the people, hold the elected government accountable for doing what they say they're going to do in order to protect the interests of us, the people, not the money-hungry industry. 3 years ago, there was 2.7% of the highest productivity old growth forests remaining, which represented less than 1% of the forests in the province, and they're still being logged as I speak, with relatively little headway actually being made to change the way the industry operates, despite it being what the people have overwhelmingly demanded. So take a moment here and call up BC Premier David Eby at 250-387-1715 to let him know that while we see the hard work they're doing, there's still much more that needs to be done to close these loopholes and change forest practices to keep old growth forests standing while restoring the health and function of our lands for a better future for all of us who call them home.